Hello, my name is Troy Long, and I am the therapist for this group. And as you have seen before, we are talking about Alzheimer's. So I'll go ahead and get started. Two of the main things that are known about Alzheimer's are that changes in the brain occur due to an increase of plaque buildup and an increase of neurofibrillary tangles. So as you can read, plaque is small round beta amyloid proteins that are outside the neurons. So basically beta amyloids just make crucial amino acids, but they are very, very important and have a large role in the development of Alzheimer's disease. So there could either be an increased number of the beta amyloid proteins or there's a decrease in the mechanism used to clear them. National Institute of Health actually did a study talking about the lymphatic system, and it shows that during sleep the lymphatic system works to clear these beta amyloids out of your brain. So having a lack of sleep or insomnia may be an implication of Alzheimer's, and I'll hit on that more a little bit later. Another important piece about beta amyloid is that different variants. So beta amyloid 42 is actually a variant that is longer in form, and this may increase the likelihood of plaque buildup due to the increase in length. And lastly, beta amyloid typically clusters and is most commonly in the frontal lobe. So we've discussed implication of the frontal lobe and many other disorders so far this year, but as a review, frontal cortex specifically is extremely important for executive functioning and emotion, fear regulation, and problem solving. So from some of the things that you probably just know already about Alzheimer's, this makes sense that the buildup could be in this area. So now to switch focus to the neurofibrillary tangles. So what these are twisted protein filaments composed largely of protein tau and axons on neurons. So the biggest implication for tau in relation to Alzheimer's is that they stabilize microtubules. So with dysfunctions and the cells not working properly, these can accumulate into tangles because without the stabilization of microtubules, then neurons begin to kind of fall apart and the axons diminish, and that excess tau creates tangles. Unfortunately, this also often leads to neuron dysfunction or neuron death. These tangles are most common in the hippocampus, which is very important with memory, and as we know, memory loss is one of the most common and well-known features of Alzheimer's disease. Okay, moving on to slide 3. So this picture is a good representation of what we were just discussing with the beta amyloid protein and the neurofibrillary tangles. It shows in the circle to the right what neurons in the brain look like for an individual with Alzheimer's. So it shows that plaque buildup, the shrinkage of neurons, the tangles discussed, and then the circle on the left shows what a normal healthy brain looks like in relation to the neurons. But because of all of this, there's a lot of implications to the actual brain structure. So there is an immune response to the buildup of beta amyloid proteins, and microglial cells cannot get rid of and remove them quick enough, which leads to astrocytes coming in for that immune response, and there's a buildup of those astrocytes, which leads to the inflammation and all these changes I'm going to discuss. So first, there's a decrease in acetylcholine, and that's a neurotransmitter. We've discussed it a little bit, but not too much. And in the brain, it's important for memory, arousal, attention, and motivation. Another response is a decrease in glutamatergic neurons, which is very important in learning and memory. So the loss of these neurotransmitters and therefore loss of cells leads to shrinkage in the brain. So the first two places the shrinkage affects most are hippocampus and cerebral cortex. So we've already discussed the hippocampus and its implication with memory, but the cerebral cortex is also really important. It processes information and language. So it's the thinking, perceiving, and again, processing, things related to intelligence and personality. And we know another common symptom of this disorder is cognitive decline. So these are both very, very important. The next regions of the brain that are typically damaged or shrink are the frontal and parietal lobes. So we're going to discuss the frontal with the executive functioning, but parietal is important for sensory information and spatial awareness. And this also leads to an increased ventricle size. So you can see in this picture the increase in ventricles and the shrinkage in all of these areas, and it shows how the brain could progress from healthy to a mild Alzheimer's to severe Alzheimer's. Something that is kind of interesting, has positives and negatives to it, but the motor areas of the brain are less affected. So this is good because an individual often can keep their independence and be able to move on their own for a long time until the Alzheimer's has progressed and is extremely severe. But a negative of this is that it's harder to diagnose Alzheimer's earlier because you're not seeing those physical signs. It may just start with an individual misplacing their keys and they can't find where they put them, just like some little memory problems, and eventually it can progress to forgetting your child's name or even forgetting that you have a child. Okay, so moving on to slide 4, I'm going to discuss some genetics and implications of that. So like any disorder, there's a genetic environment interaction. So just because you have a family member with Alzheimer's or because you have any of the polymorphisms I'm going to discuss does not automatically mean you'll have Alzheimer's and vice versa. So the genetics play a different role between early onset and late onset Alzheimer's. Early onset occurs between ages 30 and 40 and is relatively rare. When you hear Alzheimer's, you think of the late onset happening in 60s or later. So I'm going to focus on that late onset. And with that, the heritability rate is 60 to 80%, which is pretty large. It means that there definitely is a genetic side to Alzheimer's. So they have done many genome-wide association studies and have discovered 19 specific genetic loci that could be related to the disorder. Although that sounds like a great number, that still only accounts for a very small amount of the risk for developing Alzheimer's. The one specific one that has been identified I want to discuss is the APOE4 polymorphism. So this is a polymorphism on chromosome 19, and having one allele increases the risk of getting Alzheimer's by 20%, but having both alleles, this, as you can imagine, increases it even more. So some of the things that have been found with having the APOE4 polymorphism are an increase in production of beta amyloid and a decrease in the clearing mechanisms, which you already know from our earlier discussions that is huge in the development of Alzheimer's. It also decreases the neurons in the hippocampus and also has been linked to low glucose metabolism in the brain. So we've discussed PET scans in the past that they work by seeing what areas of the brain have the most glucose being used, because that means they're being activated and those brain regions are very, very active and functioning. So with less glucose metabolism, there is less functioning in those areas of the brain. Moving on to slide 5. This is actually a graphic from our book, but I thought it does a good job of kind of tying together everything I've discussed so far. So it talks about that specific polymorphism, the APOE4, and it shows how it leads to an increase of the beta amyloid, and then it's kind of a chain reaction from there. The beta amyloid then leads to plaque buildup, which leads to tau protein dysfunctioning, and therefore the death of neurons. Now to slide 6. There's a lot of different lifestyle risk factors that have been found to have a connection with Alzheimer's. So in this case, some of the negative risk factors are social isolation and insomnia, and by negative I mean it increases the risk of developing Alzheimer's. So social isolation is basically just living life without any or many, I guess, social interactions. But interestingly enough, studies have also showed that just feeling lonely while still having social interactions can also be a risk. So some of the hypotheses as to why this may increase risk of Alzheimer's are that it could lead to other lifestyle changes. So it may lead to an increased level of drinking or a decrease in exercise. Another important negative risk factor is insomnia. So I already discussed before the lymphatic system and how during sleep it helps to clear some of the beta amyloid buildup in the brain. But sleep is also very important for many other things. So during time of sleep is when memories are typically stored for long term, and a lack of sleep can lead to a decrease in ability to problem solve and attention, which are extremely important. So those are the two main negative risk factors, and then some positive risk factors are exercise, cognitive engagement, education, and a Mediterranean diet. So the two most researched risk factors are exercise and cognitive engagement. But just a quick note on the Mediterranean diet, I thought it was kind of interesting. It's basically a pescatarian diet, which is eating fish and seafood, and then mainly vegetables, like high degree of fruits, vegetables, whole foods, legumes, and they avoid processed foods altogether. So there's not a lot of research to see how this specifically is implicated in Alzheimer's disease, but it is just kind of an interesting note. But going back to exercise and cognitive engagement, exercise has been shown to decrease levels of plaque even if you do have that APOE4 polymorphism. So it kind of works against the negative impacts of that polymorphism. But the caveat to a lot of the research with exercise is that Alzheimer's begins to change the brain up to 20 years before a diagnosis is even made. So these changes in the brain could lead to a decrease in motivation to exercise, which could be where this correlation between exercise and decrease of plaque is found. Specifically with cognitive activities, basically research kind of think of it as a use it or lose it type of technique. So individuals even with the same levels of plaque, if they engage in cognitive activity, have better cognitive function. And one of the reasons this is thought to be is because they develop what's called a cognitive reserve. And basically they use alternative systems, neurons, tracks in their brains to still be able to have the same cognitive function. So basically, in summary, there are a lot of different factors that go into Alzheimer's. There's been a lot of research done so far, but there is obviously always still more to learn on the subject. If you go to the next slide, you can see my resources for this presentation, and thanks for watching.